Welcome to the review of Conquests of Camelot, The Search for the Grail. The game was created by Sierra Online and released in 1989. It's a typical Sierra adventure game and utilizes the SCI engine. The game was actually created by Christy Marks and her husband Peter Ledger. In fact, there's a whole Conquest series of games, and this is the first in the series. The engine supports up to 16 colors of EGA graphics, and of course you can see some dithering going on right now if you look at the robe of that king. The main plot of the game is Camelot has gone into a decline and is under a curse. You play King Arthur and you're trying to search for 3 missing knights and the Holy Grail. And part of the background of the story is there's a love triangle going on between King Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, which kind of pops up here and there throughout the game. The game is quite linear, and you have to complete certain portions of the game in order to continue onward. So here you can see we start inside the castle in Camelot, and you can see that text messages appear in the screen in the gray. It has a typical Sierra text parsing capability. Here we're putting on the male armor. And it tells us you can't wear it under your court clothes. So we're already starting to see that it's a little tedious sometimes, the process you have to go through in order to make things happen with the text parsing. We're using ad-lib sound here, which is actually quite beautiful. Mark Siebert was the composer, and he did an excellent job. The game does allow point-and-click capabilities, which is much more handy than having to walk right next to the object or window, for example, and then having to say look. Or you don't have to say look at window, you can just point and click, and it'll give you information about that particular context. You can also move not only by the keyboard keys, but also right-clicking in a given direction. There's little pop-ups for various graphics. For example, looking inside your purse will show you the gold, silver, and copper inside. Some of the controls can actually be quite confusing and difficult to get used to at first. For example, here I'm on a mini-map walking around with a little icon representing Arthur. And each of those rooms represents where you can go, but you can only go into certain ones. Here we're in the garden with Guinevere, and you can see how pretty the EGA graphics are. And this game makes fantastic use of dithering. Dithering, of course, is a special technique used in which pixels of various colors are placed around each other to kind of give the illusion or perception that there's more color than what there actually is. If you look at the wall, for example, next to Guinevere, it looks like different shades of gray, but in reality that's not the case. This game doesn't actually have that much Sierra humor in it. It has some, but not as much as, for example, Space Quest or even King's Quest. But there are some fun and interesting things in the game, that's for sure. For example, here Guinevere actually looks toward what I call the camera, or looks toward the screen at you. That's a nice little touch. With the combination of the beautiful EGA graphics and the amazing soundtrack to the game, it really makes it feel like you're there. It feels like a genuine medieval adventure game. Here we're actually speaking with Merlin. So one thing I didn't mention about the game is there was a lot of research done by the creators. They did a lot of history research and have proper spellings for names like Lancelot and Magic with a K instead of a C. But listen to the beautiful sound in the background here. It really feels like an icy world with ice crystals forming. The music is just fantastic. It deserves to be appreciated. The sound effects are also nice. For example, here the treasurer starts putting money into a container. Remember, we're just working with the ad-lib sound here. So now we're getting some silver. And also a scoop of gold coins. The game also has the typical Sierra menu that you can access by hitting the escape key. It shows the about and credits. There's a help menu to provide basic instructions on how to play the game. It has the save game feature, which is of course priceless, and there's so many slots you can have before it fills up. There's a volume and arcade difficulty setting. The arcade difficulty basically relates to the few action scenes in the game, which I'll talk about later. But it determines how difficult or easy those particular scenes are. There's the ability to look at your inventory, see what you're carrying. And there's a draw sword option straight off the menu, but you can only do that in certain areas. The game does have a score. There's skill points, wisdom points, and soul points, which increases as you play the game. There's even some pre-typed phrases that are typical ones that you can use from the menu and it'll appear for you, and then you finish. For example, here we're asking Merlin about a mission. There is an overhead view or map at a high level, which you eventually get to in the game, and you can see all the different areas and cities and get descriptions of them, and you can choose which ones you'd like to try to travel to. And in typical Sierra text parsing fashion, sometimes it's a little awkward trying to figure out how to do things. And sometimes you're not sure if you should tell Arthur what to do, or if you use the keyboard, or how you actually do things. Here we got on the horse and we can actually control moving back and forth. We're trying to tell the mule to follow us, and that's not how you do it. You actually just start walking and it follows you. Just little nitpicking things like that, but it's not really a big deal. And the game has nice smooth animations and cool sound effects. And of course, it's not too long before you have your first death. Typical Sierra fashion. Good thing for that restore game. And the game has lots of puzzle solving. Therefore, there's a lot of clues in the game on what the future holds. Some of the clues are very helpful and others not so much. In hindsight, it makes perfect sense after you played the game and you hear some of these clues. But if you're playing it the first time, some of them really doesn't make a lot of sense. So here Lancelot's talking about being really cold and he can't move. And then here we have Galahad talking about being hidden in darkness. And no Sierra game would be complete without having its typical scavenger hunting, looking for items and looking for clues. The game does have a lot more puzzles than some of the other Sierra games I've played. And there's a lot more clues. For example, here there's these special codes on these stones. and you'll run into a lot of riddles that need to be solved. Here we can't get past this sorcery barrier without answering these riddles. So you really got to pay attention to the clues you hear during the game. Unless, of course, you cheat and use the internet. In this particular case, once a riddle is solved, one of the stones starts flashing, and then that's how you know you've completed that part of the riddle. And eventually, once you completely finish this riddle, we can walk right through this barrier. And we're teleported to a different area. Some of the riddles are more about pointing and clicking, which make it quite a bit easier than having to type in an actual word. Here, for example, we're supposed to match up these flowers. So this is more of a test than a riddle, but the game considers it a riddle. So you just have to move around until you find the flower that matches the answer to the riddle. Another example is where you're given the goddess symbols early on, and later you have to remember these and match them up during a test. Al-Sirat shows them here by carving them in the sand. So finally you end up meeting Fatima, and she tries to tempt you. And if you pass her test, then you are presented with the puzzle on the goddesses. Simple point and click, but you have to match it up, and if you fail, you get to try again. Here's another example where you have to answer something directly. You also find that there's a maze in a desert eventually, where you wander around and you can't exit unless you find the proper combinations. It can be quite frustrating. There's cool hidden passages. And some of the things to do in the game are very hard to figure out. I'm not really sure how anyone would figure them out without some kind of aid. For example, here we're calling up to this window for a woman named Mary. How would you know to do that? How would you know she was up there, and how would you even know her name? And even more bizarre is you have to throw this mirror to Mary. I mean, seriously, who would think of that? I know I don't throw mirrors every day. And then she goes away, and you have to come back later and ask her for the veil, which is another item you need. As you can guess, I had to cheat in order to get past a few parts in the game. So as I mentioned earlier, there's this overhead map in which you can move around in order to get to different places. Once you select your destination, the game engine zooms in. One of the best aspects of this game is you're going to meet so many characters. It's just rich with all kinds of different types of monsters, creatures, humanoids, and it's fun trying to figure out what to do and what kind of information you need to get from them. You'll even run into crazy people like this mad monk. or these old ones that are these spirit creatures. You'll meet characters that have no real purpose in the game except for just to give you some entertainment, such as that girl that just ran away, or these shady looking characters. As I mentioned earlier, the game is quite linear though, and you do have to do things in certain order or you can't progress. There's a lot of money giving in this game also, so you have to be careful with how much you give people and when you give it to them, otherwise you'll run out and you won't be able to complete the game. You even need money to pay people off to travel. Here we have all kinds of different destinations to go to, and you have to pick which one you want. But not only are you giving away your money, like to beggars for example, but sometimes you have to bribe people. And other times, it's getting stolen from you. Here's what happens if we don't give that creature some money. Here's this annoying thief taking our purse. And we chase him. And there's no way to get your money back. As I mentioned, there is a point in which you have to travel. And there's many different paths you can go. It just so happens that only one of the paths can be a success. All the others result in utter failure and death. It's a nice touch how it's describing what's going on as you're traveling the seas. Sierra really leaves it wide open for you to figure out where in the world to search for the Holy Grail and the knights. Here's a little moment of humor that had been lacking in the game thus far. King Arthur with a hangover. So what happens if you travel to the wrong area? That's not the only way to die, of course. Lots of falls in the game. But not all the falls are deadly. Here's a short one. Here's a long fall, but you don't end up dying. I like how the screen actually shakes there. That was a nice touch. So as I mentioned, there were 3 knights that you have to save. And here's the first one that we end up finding and saving. Put him on the horse and send him back to Camelot. There's always some kind of test you have to complete in order to save one of the nights. And I don't want to spoil every single part of the game in case someone does want to play. So I'm only going to show you what happens when you save the nights. Quite a few mythical creatures in this game that have magical powers. I love almost every aspect of this game, except for the combat scenes, or what they call the arcade scenes. They're quite awkward, and mainly because of the way the controls work. There's lots of delays to actually attacking or dodging or using a shield. Many ways to die in the game. For example, falling into some ice, or failing this flower test. Another action scene here with jousting, where we have to take on the Black Knight. And the controls were very awkward. It took me quite a while to finally beat this and to figure out what was going on. All you can do is control the angle in which your lance hits. And basically whoever gets hit 3 times loses. But if you try to move your lance too early, the Black Knight will already adjust his shield to compensate. So you kind of have to do it at the last minute. Of course, I was playing on arcade level normal. Easy might have been a lot easier, never tried it. So I finally figured out how to win and beat the Black Knight. The other goofy and awkward attack moments are when you're trying to take on these 3 monks. Only one of them is real and the other 2 are illusions. And you can see King Arthur kind of swinging his sword around in a pretty silly fashion. It's very awkward. There are cool things in the game, like this heart that you have to use, which will show you when you're getting close to a part on the ice that's going to break. There's an invisible path you have to follow in order to make it safely across the ice, and this heart helps you do that. Anytime you start getting close to a point in which you'd fall, it turns purple. And then you know you have to back up a little bit. You have to, of course, do this really slowly or you'll end up dying. So here's an example of how far you actually have to travel. I sped it up to make it quicker for the video. Eventually you'll reach an ice palace. There's also a lodestone that you have to use in order to show you what direction you're facing. You would assume that north was always pointing up, but that's not how this game works. Once you go in through a given door, the direction can completely change. So sometimes you have to use the lodestone to figure out where you're going. Especially toward the end of the game, there's a special area. You have to follow the correct direction or you'll end up dying. So in closing, I'd like to say this game was very impressive. I really enjoyed it. It was one of my favorite Sierra games, in fact. For having EGA graphics, I didn't really miss all the other colors because they did such a good job with dithering. There were a wide variety of NPCs or characters that you run across. The graphics were nice with nice little animations. Sound effects were cool. The music was fantastic. Just overall, I was very impressed. And just remember, this was 1989. So while other games may have had VGA graphics and been a little better, I feel like the flow of this game and the storyline was outstanding. Also, while you do have to kind of do scavenger hunting, it isn't overly involved. It's a great mix of puzzles, clues, and scavenging. The point-and-click interface from the SCI engine works well, gets rid of some of the tedium, and there's nice special effects and background effects, such as staying at this inn and how it looks like it's nighttime and everything gets darker. Nice little touches like that. For example, here's a cool tunnel that I found, and you hear this nice music. The music is just paramount to making this game feel real. You can see how it shaded a little bit and got darker the deeper I'm going into the tunnel. And we have this ominous music playing. Great context. Some of the scenes actually remind me of some of the other Sierra games also, like these desert scenes remind me of Space Quest. And there's a lot of nice little touches in the game, like being able to walk behind these mounds of sand, or these flies appearing on these dead boars that were left behind. Really cool. Of course, the game is riddled with the fun, typical Sierra deaths. You never feel that bad dying in this game. Here's one of the more pleasurable deaths, so to speak. Ah, what a way to go. There's a cool, creepy zombie arm scene, too. How cool is that? All the tests and puzzles you have to complete in the game are actually quite fun once you figure out the clues and know how to do them. So here we have to figure out which way to get out of this place. We're in the middle of the catacombs, and if you make a wrong move, you're dead. She tells you the direction you have to go, and if you don't use the lodestone, you're in trouble. Here's a cool dramatic death. I love how they use the music that way. There's a lot of tricky, misleading doors trying to get out, like that one. Here I thought I screwed up again. But no, they're just playing with you. So finally, with the aid of the lodestone, you can escape the catacombs. And then you're pretty much in the final scene or final area for completing the game. But before you do, unfortunately you have to face the awful game mechanics again for the combat. This was actually one of the worst. For some reason when I would push the spacebar to try to attack, there was a huge delay, and sometimes he wouldn't attack at all. And if you just keep mashing the buttons, eventually it tells you that you're going to get worn out and to slow down. But there's no other way to do it, because it just doesn't respond properly. And I don't know if maybe it was DOSBox not sending the commands properly, or if that's how the real game was, but I found it quite frustrating. So eventually here we get the message to slow down, and that's what we have to do. But I'll fast forward a little bit to show you part of the combat scene. So the next several minutes of the video are going to be the end of the game. So if you don't want to see the ending, then I recommend stop playing at this point. So I hope you enjoyed this review. Conquests of Camelot, the search for the Grail, and I'll see you next time.